This week, we'll be looking at the argument of the transcendental deduction in its 1787 edition. Last time, we considered what Kant intends to prove. We looked at two different ways Kant frames his project. Kant characterized his opponents as a Lockean who would attempt to justify the categories on the basis of particular experiences, and also a Humean who maintains that our application of the categories is not justified, but is rather necessitated by our subjective habits of mind. In addition, Kant frames his project by returning to the question that he initially framed in his 1772 letter to Hertz. The question is how the categories, as a priori concepts, can relate to the objects given in our experience. The objects can't make our a priori concepts possible, since it's empirical concepts that are made possible by objects. And our a priori concepts can't produce their objects, since it's representations of the will, and not concepts of the understanding that produce their objects. Now, in the reading for today, in section 27 of the transcendental deduction, Kant identifies another opponent, and he does so by imagining another sort of response to this question of how our a priori concepts relate to objects. This other opponent is reminiscent of Leibniz's pre-established harmony theory. According to this Leibnizian view, the categories are subjective predispositions for thinking, implanted in us along with our existence by our author, in such a way that their use would agree exactly with the laws of nature along which experience runs. Now, if you recall, from Kant's letter to Hertz, he rejects a pre-established harmony view for the reasons that it's circular and dogmatic. But in section 27 of the critique, Kant raises a different objection. Here he writes, "This would be decisive against the supposed middle way, that in such a case the categories would lack the necessity that's essential to their concept." He goes on, for example, the concept of cause, which asserts the necessity of a consequent under a presupposed condition, would be false if it rested only on a subjective necessity, arbitrarily implanted in us, of combining certain empirical representations according to such a rule of relation. I would not be able to say that the effect is combined with the cause in the object, but only that I am so constituted that I cannot think of this representation otherwise than as so connected, which is precisely what the skeptic wishes most. So Kant's criticism here is that the Leibnizian pre-established harmony view in fact grants what the Humean skeptic wishes most. How so? Well, Kant's explanation is that according to Hume, we must apply the categories in our experience, but we're not justified in doing so. The reason we must apply the categories in our experience is simply due to our subjective habits of mind. On the Leibnizian view, we must apply the categories in our experience because of the way our minds are constituted a priori by God. And God makes it the case that the objects of our possible experience do in fact fall under the categories. But Kant thinks that on this view, our application of the categories to the objects of our possible experience remains unjustified. And this is because our reason for applying the categories is because of the way our minds are constituted. Kant thinks that in order for our application of the categories to the objects of our experience to be justified, our reason for applying the categories in our experience must be not because of the way our minds are constituted, but rather because of what the objects of our possible experience are as objects of our possible experience. So what Kant will have to do to justify the categories in his transcendental deduction is articulate for us what it is for an object to be an object of our possible experience. And then he'll have to show that objects can be objects of our possible experience only if they stand under the categories. Now, Kant's argument in the transcendental deduction is divided into two parts. Kant discusses the original synthetic unity of apperception in section 16 and judgment in section 19, and then in section 20 draws the conclusion that all sensible intuitions stand under the categories. While this might seem to be the conclusion that Kant is aiming to prove in his transcendental deduction, in section 21, Kant explains that he's only just made the beginning of a deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding. And he writes that in section 26, the aim of the deduction will first be fully attained by showing from the way in which the empirical intuition is given in sensibility that its unity can be none other than the one the category prescribes. This poses a problem for interpreters of Kant's deduction. We need to distinguish what Kant argues for in sections 16 through 19 of the transcendental deduction, where Kant discusses apperception and judgment, from what Kant argues for in sections 24 and 26 of the transcendental deduction, where Kant turns his discussion to space and time. We have to explain how the first result makes a beginning of the deduction, and how the second result first fully attains the deduction's aim. The Kant scholar Dieter Henrich has called this the problem of the two steps in one proof, and what it'll take to solve this problem is explaining how each part of the deduction establishes a result that's necessary but independently insufficient for justifying the categories. So now let's turn to the details of Kant's argument. The first main topic in the first part of the transcendental deduction is the original synthetic unity of apperception discussed in section 16. Here Kant writes, "The I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is as much to say that the representation would either be impossible or else at least would be nothing for me. That representation that can be given prior to all thinking is called intuition. Thus, all manifold of intuition has a necessary relation to the I think in the same subject in which this manifold is to be encountered. But this representation is an act of spontaneity. That is, it cannot be regarded as belonging to sensibility. So in this passage, Kant attempts to identify a necessary relation between the manifold of intuition and the understanding. The relation is that the manifold of intuition must be able to be accompanied by the I think. Now Kant almost says that the manifold of intuition must be able to be accompanied by the I think, if it's to be possible at all. But he backs off this strong claim and instead says that the manifold of intuition must be able to be accompanied by the I think, if it is to be something for me. What's the difference here? The strong claim that Kant considers but then backs off from making would rule out the possibility of unconscious representations that would not be able to be made conscious. Now, Kant doesn't rule out that such representations are possible. What he does instead is point out that such representations are nothing for me as a cognizer. The thought here is that in order for a representation in the manifold of intuition to have any sort of cognitive significance, for a representation in the manifold of intuition to serve as an input to the cognitive process, I must be able to become self-consciously aware of that representation. This is what it means to be able to attach the I think to the representation. For a representation to have a cognitive significance for me, it's not enough that I have the representation. I must, moreover, be able to become aware of myself as having the representation. To see what Kant's getting at here, I think it helps to consider what it takes for an element of our visual field, for example, to serve as a reason for an empirical judgment. Suppose I'm birdwatching, and suppose there is an oriole in my visual field. Does the occurrence of the oriole in my visual field give me a reason to judge that there's an oriole over there? Kant's thought is, the presence of the oriole in my visual field alone is insufficient for me to have a reason to judge that there's an oriole over there. More than the mere occurrence of the oriole in my visual field, I have to take notice of the oriole in my visual field. It's only if I can attach my conscious awareness to that representation of the oriole in my visual field that the presence of the oriole in my visual field can give me a reason to judge that there's an oriole over there. Now, the next question Kant asks is what enables me to attach the I think to any given representation in the manifold of intuition? What Kant has said so far is that I must be able to attach the I think to any representation that has cognitive significance for me. The question he raises now is how can I become able to attach the I think to a representation? And he writes, it's only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it's possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations itself. That is, the analytical unity of apperception is only possible under the presupposition of some synthetic one. So the analytical unity of apperception is Kant's term for the I think, which is able to be attached to any of my cognitively significant representations. The synthetic unity of apperception, by contrast, is Kant's term for the various representations that go together in my representation of any particular object. So in the case of the oriole, the synthetic unity of apperception would be the unity of the representations of the oriole's shape, its size, its having a beak and wings, and its color, the orange and the black. And now Kant's claim is that I'm able to attach the I think to my representation of the oriole because it's an act of synthesis of my understanding that united all of these features into a single representation of an oriole. Now, these considerations are meant to show that there is a necessary relationship between any cognitively significant representation in the manifold of intuition and the spontaneous acts of the understanding. What remains unclear, however, is why the manifold of intuition should bear any relationship to the categories. Remember from last week, Kant introduces the categories by correlating them with the forms of unity in judgments. What Kant has just shown us is that representations can become cognitively significant for me only if the understanding does some work in synthesizing the various elements in a given intuition into the representation of an object. But why should we think that in synthesizing the manifold of intuition into the representation of an object, the understanding uses the very same functions that it uses when uniting concepts into judgments? Why should we think there's any relationship between the synthetic unity of apperception and the categories introduced as forms of unity in judgment? It's to address this worry that Kant turns in section 19 of the Transcendental Deduction to the topic of judgment. Kant begins this section by reflecting on the definition of judgment. Kant writes, I have never been able to satisfy myself with the explanation that the logicians give of a judgment. It is, they say, a representation of a relation between two concepts. Now, Kant himself grants that a judgment is a relationship between concepts, but Kant's criticism of the logicians is that it is not here determined wherein this relation consists. Kant explains, if I investigate more closely the relation of given cognitions in every judgment, and distinguish that relation as something belonging to the understanding from the relation in accordance with laws of the reproductive imagination, which has only subjective validity, then I find that a judgment is nothing other than the way to bring given cognitions to the objective unity of apperception. So Kant's thought here is that mere associations of ideas, which are merely subjective, and judgments, which are meant to be objective, are both relationships between concepts. Judgments, therefore, must be more than just relationships between concepts. Kant's thought is that there must be something that makes judgments objective that mere associations lack, and hence are merely subjective. What it is that judgments possess and mere associations of ideas lack is a relationship to the original synthetic unity of apperception. Kant explains that the concepts related in a judgment belong to one another in virtue of the necessary unity of the apperception in the synthesis of intuitions. So Kant's thought here is that in a mere association of ideas, for example, the association of ravens and writing desks, there's no reason why these two concepts are brought together. By contrast, in the judgment that this book is blue, the concepts blue and book are brought together in a judgment, and there is a reason why. The reason why the concepts of book and blue are brought together in my judgment, this book is blue, is that the representations of book and blue are together in the synthetic unity of my intuition of this blue book. My synthetically unified intuition of this blue book provides the reason for me to relate the concepts of blue and book into the judgment, this book is blue. And this judgment is an objective judgment, precisely because the reason that my concepts are related in this judgment is because of the relation of representations in my synthetically unified intuition. Now, how do these considerations show us that the manifold of intuition stands under the categories? Kant's thought is that the logical functions of judgment serve as the rules for combining concepts into judgments. The categories are concepts for the synthesis of intuition that correspond to these rules. And now Kant's claim is that in order for synthetically unified intuitions to provide the reasons for our relations of concepts and judgment, they must be united in accordance with the principles of the objective determination of all representations, insofar as cognition can come from them. So the thought here is that it's only if the categories serve as rules for the synthetic unity of intuitions that synthetically unified intuitions can serve as reasons for the relations of concepts and judgments, since the logical forms of judgment serve as the rules for the relations of concepts and judgments. So the thought is that if there's ever going to be an objective judgment, that judgment, A, has to consist of concepts that are unified according to the logical functions of judgment, and B, the concepts in that judgment have to be unified on the basis of some synthetically unified intuition, and C, that synthetically unified intuition must be unified in accordance with the categories. Now the question is, does this show us that the categories are not merely subjective dispositions for thinking, either inculcated through habit or implanted by God, but rather objective and justified, necessary conditions of the possibility of experience? Well, I think what Kant is entitled to conclude is that we need to apply the categories in synthesizing the manifold of intuition, not just because of the way the mind is, not just because the categories are our a priori concepts, but in order for the manifold of intuition to be an object about which we can make judgments. So in this sense, Kant has shown that it's in the nature of an appearance as an object about which we can make judgments that appearances must stand under the categories. But now the question is, why does this result constitute only the beginning of a transcendental deduction? What more does Kant need to show in order to justify our application of the categories to the objects of our possible experience? What Kant sets out to show in section 26 of the transcendental deduction is the possibility of cognizing a priori through the categories whatever objects may come before our senses. So the thought here is that while in the first part of the transcendental deduction, Kant aimed to show that insofar as appearances are objects of possible judgments, they must stand under the categories. In the second part of the transcendental deduction, Kant seeks to show that simply insofar as appearances are objects of possible sensible intuitions, they must stand under the categories. But now, why should Kant have to show this? If we've already seen that in order for appearances to be objects of our possible judgments, they must stand under the categories, why wouldn't it simply follow that the objects of our possible sensible intuitions stand under the categories? After all, aren't the objects presented to us in our intuitions the very objects that we make judgments about? The worry here, I think, is that we already know something about the objects of our possible sensible intuitions. Remember, the result of Kant's transcendental aesthetic is that space and time are the forms of our sensible intuitions. So all the objects of our possible sensible intuitions are ordered in space and time. We've seen in the first part of the transcendental deduction that if objects are to be able to serve as the reasons for our judgments, those objects must be united under the categories. The worry is whether the forms of space and time and the forms of the categories are compatible. If these forms were incompatible, then the objects of our sensible intuitions would be spatiotemporal objects. The only objects about which we can make judgments would be categorical objects, and none of the objects of our sensible intuitions would be objects about which we can make judgments. In this case, judgment would be impossible. All of our thinking would be the mere association of ideas. In this case, our application of the categories to the objects of our possible experience would be unjustified. So what Kant has to show is that the objects of our possible sensible intuitions, just in virtue of being spatiotemporal objects, are by that very fact categorial objects. Kant has to show that there's a compatibility between the spatiotemporal form of intuition and the categorial form of objects of our possible judgments. Now, Kant seeks to do this by considering space and time themselves. Kant writes, space and time are represented a priori, not merely as forms of sensible intuition, but also as intuitions themselves, which contain a manifold, and thus with the determination of the unity of this manifold in them. Kant continues, in the footnote, space, represented as object, as is really required in geometry, contains more than the mere form of intuition, namely, the comprehension of the manifold given in accordance with the form of sensibility, in an intuitive representation, so that the form of intuition merely gives the manifold, but the formal intuition gives the unity of the representation. Kant's claim here is that while space and time, as the forms of our intuition, provide an order to the sensations in the manifold of intuition, we also have a representation of space and time themselves, as the forms of intuition. For Kant, this is our formal intuition of space and time. The formal intuition of space and time is a representation of the forms of our sensibility. When we represent space and time, absent of all the objects and events in space and time, what we're representing, according to Kant, are the very forms of our faculty of sensibility. Now, what Kant points out in section 26 of the Transcendental Deduction is that our formal intuitions themselves possess a synthetic unity. Space and time themselves are manifolds that must be united in our formal intuitions. Since Kant has already argued that the categories are responsible for the synthetic unity of the manifold of intuition, Kant is entitled to conclude that the categories are responsible for the synthetic unity of our formal intuitions of space and time. Now, since these are representations of our forms of intuition, the categories are required for our representation of the spatio-temporal unity of the manifold of intuitions. Kant concludes that all synthesis, through which even perception itself becomes possible, stands under the categories. Now, this is meant to remove the worry that the objects of our possible sensible intuitions might not be suitable objects about which to make judgments. What Kant has shown is that just as the objects about which we can make judgments must stand under the categories, the objects of our sensible intuitions must too stand under the categories, because the objects of our sensible intuitions are ordered in space and time, and the categories are required for the representations of space and time. Now, this is how Kant finally justifies our application of the categories to the objects of our possible experience. He shows that we have to apply the categories in our experience, not just because of our subjective habits of mind, or because of the subjective rules hardwired into our understanding, but rather because of what it is for an appearance to be an object of our possible experience. For an appearance to be an object about which we can make judgments, it must have a synthetic unity in accordance with the categories, and in order for an appearance to be an object of our possible sensible intuitions, it must be ordered in space and time. And yet, the categories are required for representing the synthetic unity of space and time themselves. Now, in your papers for this week, you might try to evaluate this argument on its own terms. Are you persuaded by Kant's account of apperception, judgment, and the formal intuitions of space and time? Does the argument Kant actually provides achieve the aim that he articulates at the very beginning and the very end of the deduction? And do the two parts of the deduction provide necessary yet independently insufficient arguments for the deduction's proof? Alternatively, you might consider one of the readings for this week, and consider to what extent you think that reading articulates a satisfactory interpretation of the deduction.